focus on what matters.
Welcome to our Data Security in the Hybrid World virtual event. I'm Brian Walsh, future correspondent at Axios, and I'm coming to you from Santa Clara, California. Welcome to our audiences on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and on Axios.com. Join the conversation today on Twitter with @Axios and #Axios Events. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll examine security vulnerabilities of the accelerated digitization of our world, consider how to create a safer online ecosystem. Our first guest is the California Congressman Ted Lieu, joining us today from Washington, D.C. Representative Lieu, hello.
Thank you, Brian. Honored to be on the show.
Good. So after the Colonial Pipeline hike, the SolarWinds attack, are we at the point where cybersecurity threats to the U.S. government and to private businesses is really being taken seriously enough, in your opinion?
As a recovering computer science major, it's pretty clear to me that we're still way behind in terms of cybersecurity. I think the federal government is now much more aware of these threats. I'm pleased the Biden administration is taking it more seriously. Unfortunately, during the Trump administration, they actually eliminated cybersecurity positions. The Biden administration, on the other hand, is doing much more in terms of cybersecurity and trying to protect our federal government from being hacked.
Now, among other things, you put forward the Improving Contractor Cybersecurity Act, which would require federal vendors to maintain vulnerability disclosure and programs. In the absence of this, are contractors and vendors like that, are they a weak link in overall government cybersecurity defense?
Yes, they are. And something to understand about the federal government is we don't really make stuff. We have private contractors make things. And so when you have all these private contractors in the supply chain, and when it comes to software and even hardware, if you don't have vulnerability disclosures, those are weak links, and people can go through these weak links and then attack the federal government systems.
Are you concerned, even if the federal government does move forward on toughening cybersecurity standards, that that might not be followed by states and municipalities, so that they might move to pass their own laws to hamper those requirements at the local level? And we know, those towns and states, they're being targeted as well.
So sometimes it's okay for states to move forward with their own standards. Sometimes it's really, really difficult and makes things nearly impossible to implement. So I actually have, for example, the Encrypt Act, which prevents states from coming up with their own encryption standards, because it's really difficult for a company such as Google or Apple to have to come up with 50 possible different standards for their phones if 50 different states went out and did their own standards. So sometimes you just have to say, no, the federal government is going to preempt their field. And that's what makes most sense in this specific situation.
Mm-hmm. Is there bipartisan agreement around the need for these kind of measures? I mean, it's clearly a threat that affects us all, but when you're looking at Capitol Hill, is this something that breaks down by parties, or is this something that everyone understands what we need to do more about it?
It's the latter. You actually do see significant bipartisan agreement on cybersecurity issues. There's no such thing as a Republican cybersecurity offense or a Democratic cybersecurity defense. It's just cybersecurity, and we all want to improve it. One of the bills that got signed into law last term was a bipartisan bill with Senator Portman and other Republicans that improved cybersecurity at the Department of Homeland Security. We're trying to now improve cybersecurity at the Department of State, and this is an issue that can get bipartisan support.
A new threat surface, I suppose, when it comes to cybersecurity is the Internet of Things, growing number of connected devices that many of us have in our homes. How concerned are you that as these devices do proliferate, that's really is going to increase the threat surface and that they may not be secured sufficiently, and that could not just affect businesses again, but individuals as well?
The internet is a wonderful thing, and it's made our lives better. It also has a dark side, and hackers can take advantage of that. So let me give you an analogy. If you were to walk into Target and buy a lamp and bring it home, and you plug that lamp in, you wouldn't expect it to explode. And that's because Target knows that, hey, if we sell lamps that have been certified, let's say by Underwriters Laboratory or another certification authority, these lamps are unlikely to malfunction. And the manufacturers know that if they get their product certified, let's say by Underwriters Laboratory, then Target is more willing to sell their lamps. Unfortunately, when it comes to products with cyber assets and cyber functions in them, and they're connected to the internet, there's no such notification to the consumer or any sort of certification. So you could bring in a webcam and plug it in, and all of a sudden, instead of looking at your kid with a webcam, some hacker takes advantage of that webcam and starts looking at your kid and then uses that webcam to look at other things in your house. So Senator Mark and I have introduced legislation that would allow companies to put on a cyber shield if they meet certain certifications that the private sector would do. So we want to implement something like that, and hopefully we can get that into law.
As you mentioned, the internet has given us amazing things. It actually enabled many of us to work throughout the course of this pandemic remotely. But how do you balance that, the benefits that the internet, or for that matter, connected devices, can bring with that threat, and also ensure that legislation doesn't overly hamper what would be useful innovation?
So as a member of Congress, I basically take the view that everything I do could appear on the front pages of the New York Times tomorrow. And if I'm okay with that, then I go ahead and write that email or send that text. But if not, then I'm not going to do that. So I'm very aware, and I hope more and more people become aware how easy their phones can be hacked. Just something as simple as connecting your Wi-Fi in a public place. If you were at Starbucks, for example, and you want to connect to the Wi-Fi, and Starbucks_1 shows up and Starbucks 1 shows up, would you know which one was the correct Wi-Fi? I wouldn't, and you wouldn't. If you connected the wrong Wi-Fi, it could be a hacker sitting 7 feet away from you that in just seconds gets all the information on your phone. And so we just need to raise more awareness of everyone in terms of cyber hygiene. And by the way, I would never recommend using public Wi-Fi unless you're very sure of the exact address you're connecting to.
I'm just curious, do you get the sense other members of Congress have that same level of awareness when it comes to that threat? Obviously, you're thinking very closely about that just personally within your own professional role, but is that awareness even reached those levels of government?
Some members are, unfortunately, I think many do not think about that. And one of the things I did a few years ago, I worked with Republican Congressman Will Hurd at the time, and we got basically our House administration to at least do more to protect cell phones that members had, because that was one of the weak links in our system, since a lot of us actually do work on our cell phones and it's connected into our system here at the House. The fact that our laptop has all this amazing cybersecurity on it, but our phones didn't, really stood out as a sore thumb, and we got some more cybersecurity on phones. But a lot of members weren't aware of that either.
Now, another area of threat that I know you're concerned about is space and how space is connected to cybersecurity. Tell me a little bit more about what the worry is there, and also what can be done about it.
So I want people to understand how important space is to daily activities. Your ATM transactions depend on satellites in space. GPS, farmers who are using sort of certain agricultural vehicles require space satellites to help them navigate. You have so many things are dependent on space, and yet space is not designated as critical infrastructure. We have certain sectors of our economy, such as agriculture and transportation, for example, that are designated as critical infrastructure. I think space also needs to be designated as that, and I bipartisan legislation to, in fact, do that. Hopefully, we can also get that signed into law.
Now, I'm actually in your home state right now, California, at a quantum computing conference, and there's concern, I think, that as quantum computing grows in powers, becomes more effective, it could eventually break all known cryptography on the internet. How concerned are you about that future quantum threat to cybersecurity, and what can be done now to prepare for that day?
By the way, you look happy and great, and I attribute that to being in my home state of California.
Absolutely.
It is, first of all, I think quantum computing is amazing, and I want to continue technological progress. And by the way, you cannot stop progress. You can maybe try to regulate some of it, but you're not going to stop technological progress. And there may be one day where it gets to a point where quantum computing or something else can break a lot of cryptological locks. And that would be a problem. And then we've got to figure out another way to handle that. Encryption is actually what allows, for example, our military to do what it needs to do. It allows the president to communicate. It allows your banking transactions to be secure. So encryption is very important. But if that can be broken, then we've got to figure out a whole new way to try to address it.
And just lastly, very quickly, you mentioned you were a recovering computer science major. That's kind of a rare background in Congress. Do we need more people who have that experience with tech?
I think it'd be helpful if we had more people with technological experience, both as members of Congress, but also on staff on Capitol Hill. It's a great place to work. If everyone wants to come to Capitol Hill, please consider that.
Thank you, Representative Lieu.
Thank you.
And next, we have a view from the top segment with my colleague, SVP of Product and Technology at Axios, Melanie Colton.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you to our sponsor, ForgeRock, for making this conversation possible. Now joining us from San Francisco is CEO of ForgeRock, Fran Rosch.
Hello, Melanie. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So every business is running toward or being pulled from omni-channel commerce, an all-channel retail approach. What will the next 12 months hold for the relationship between businesses and consumers?
Yes, I think digital transformation has been happening for many years, but we've really seen it accelerate during the pandemic, where really every worker became a remote worker, and more of us started running our entire lives online as it was not safe to go out, whether it's banking, shopping, government services, telco media, everything went digital. And technology leaders are under increasing pressure to create better experiences as they compete in their individual markets. So it's easy onboarding, personalized experience, self-serving. It's really become critical to a business's bottom line. And performance is more important than other. We had one bank during the pandemic that saw a 90% drop in branch banking traffic, but a 300% increase in digital. So, it's really been that huge shift. And I think it's the new normal. So to answer your question about the next 12 months, it's going to be more of the same, more of this move to digital. And that puts a lot of pressure on these businesses to create better experiences without sacrificing on security.
So let's talk about another stress on these businesses, the Great Resignation. We don't expect this to be anything relenting in 2022, but how can companies endure and even thrive as employees churn and there seems to be no end in sight?
Well, I think the biggest focus should be focused on trying to keep your best employees. And I think in this world, that's about giving them flexibility. It used to be you have to come into an office, work certain times of days on certain devices. Now it's all about flexibility, letting employees work from anywhere at any time and any device. They just want to get their work done. And that's how they should be measured. In fact, I have a 25-year-old nephew who works for a top 10 bank, and he and his girlfriend have been living out of a van for the past 6 months, but they've been getting their work done. And that's what's important. So technology leaders at these companies need to find a way to be able to onboard employees who they've never met, give them easy access to the applications and services they need to do their jobs from any device, anywhere at any time. That's the way they're going to keep the young top talent and keep their businesses thriving.
And in keeping their businesses thriving, how concerned are you about the increasing number of data breaches and hacks and ransomware and discoveries of overreach that have been skyrocketing and also show no signs of relenting? How can businesses help turn the tide, and what role can companies perform in being able to mitigate these nefarious acts?
Yeah, cybersecurity is clearly to be a huge problem. Every time we open the newspaper, we read about a new attack, a new set of ransomware. So, this security continues to be a huge problem for companies. And fundamentally, we just think the internet is broken in a lot of ways from a security perspective. The usernames and passwords have now been around for over 60 years as the way that we identify and authenticate ourselves. And it's clearly broken as so many consumers use the same username and password as simple as possible across all their applications. That just doesn't work. In fact, from 2019 to 2020, we saw the percent of data breaches related to identity increase by 450%. So it continues to be the key attack vector out there. So we sort of recommend our customers there are 3 things that they should really focus on. First is recognize that the username and password is broken and either strengthen it or wherever possible to use multi-factor authentication. So not just about a username and password, but something else that you have. And the government issued the cybersecurity executive order in May of last year in response to the SolarWinds and the Colonial Pipeline breach. And it's a great report, but fundamentally it says, if you can, use MFA. So my request would be to consumers, for your banking, for your shopping, take advantage of it if it's out there. I think second, enterprises really need to adopt this concept of zero trust. It's a phrase we've heard a lot, but it just fundamentally is saying, even after you initially authenticate or identify a user, you have to continue to evaluate, look at their behavior of their device or their user behavior, to be able to identify possibly that identity's been compromised, and then maybe do a stepped up authentication. But it's just that ongoing analysis to ensure that it really is the user we believe it is, and to block malicious actors. And I think that leads to the third and maybe most exciting technology innovations around security and identity. And that's the advent of using AI to be able to frictionless and easily recognize a legitimate user through their patterns of device behavior and give them easy, frictionless access while blocking potential malicious actors. So it's really about companies getting smarter and smarter about how they recognize a legitimate user and how they block a malicious actor. So it continues to be a huge challenge. We've seen the Biden administration continue to ramp these requirements and regulations up, and I think we'll see that continue into the future.
So speaking of the relationship between consumers and businesses, personal information is constantly being accessed and used. Do consumers have the right to demand highly personalized experiences without opting in to give their data away? What do you think is that necessary balance?
I think the balance has changed here, and I think successful companies are going to build successful relationships with their customers through transparency. And just letting the customers know what information they're collecting, how they're using it, how it benefits them and the services that they provide. So privacy is important. It is our data. We're willing to share it as long as we have that sense of, transparency and that we feel like we're part of the conversation. In fact, when the iPhone gave people the opportunity to opt in or out into cross-app data sharing, 96% declined to have their information shared. So we know it's important to people, and I think companies really have to be transparent on how it's being used. I think we can also fundamentally question who owns that data. Is it the company's data, or is it the user's behavior data? Excuse me. We believe it's the user's data, so they should have a say in how it's used. That'll develop the best relationship between a company and their customer.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Fran Roche, for joining Axios today.
Thank you, Melanie. I really appreciated the opportunity to have the conversation.
And now back to my colleague, Brian.
Thanks, Melanie. Our final guest is the founding partner of the Krebs Stamos Group and former director of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, Christopher Krebs. Christopher, thanks for being here.
Hey, Brian, thanks for having me.
So we really saw digital activity of all kinds accelerate during the pandemic. How did that change the nature of the threat that businesses, but also governments here in the US really face from cybersecurity threats?
So the way I see it is the attack surface, or the devices we use to conduct business, for the government to operate. They made a pretty dramatic shift in early 2020 where everyone went home, right? So we go out of the office, bricks and mortar, we go home, and that perimeter that we're so used to having in our organizations kind of dissolved away. And it was a more diffuse enterprise approach. And so that opens the door for a lot of bad actor activity. And since then, it's even gotten more complex and complicated. There are more devices, more apps working in the cloud. We have more devices in our homes, in our cars, everywhere. And so that attack surface is rapidly changing. It's rapidly escalating. And I think the unfortunate truth is that that's really what it's going to look like for the next several years. It's only going to be more complicated and complex when we talk about the things that we're trying to defend.
You said before that you feel it might only be a matter of time before one of America's adversaries really launches what would be a really destructive cyber attack. in the real world? Thinking about that application of the threat that you talked about, I mean, what might that look like? And are there areas or infrastructure areas of our vulnerability that you're most concerned about when you think about that?
Well, I think, we need to look at some of the things that the U.S. government has put out, some of the alerts and notifications. If I think back to this summer, there was a report put out by my old agency, CISA and FBI, about some Chinese state-sponsored attackers that were targeting natural gas pipelines back in about 2013. And as I think through why might they be doing this, I don't necessarily think that a so-called cyber strike or any sort of attack like that would be a standalone. And instead, I think what would happen is that sort of aggressive tactic would be part and parcel of a larger, more complex approach by an adversary. So if things get hot in Taiwan, there's a possibility that the Chinese government could use some sort of cyber capability to make us focus here rather than over there. Same thing, depending on what happens with Russia and Ukraine. So we need to keep in mind that there are not, it's not just about intelligence operations, but using technology to disrupt the decision calculus of our allies is absolutely within the strategy of our adversaries.
Well, thinking about how one would defend against that attack or some of the other attacks that might be out there, I mean, can you defend everything? Do you have to focus, especially thinking as the U.S. government, on really sensitive areas, really important areas where, we can put a lot of our force there, or at least a lot of our defense there, and accept that there may be attacks elsewhere?
Well, that's been a mentality in the information security community for quite some time. It's a concept known as assume breach and layered defense, where you assume you're going to have a bad day. And the idea is, how do you recover from that? How do you minimize downtime? And I think that's what was in part so instructive about the Colonial Pipeline ransomware event this year, where it kind of dawned upon people that there can be a functional disruption due to a cyber event, due to a ransomware event. So I think what we have to do, and I think what we're seeing happen in the policy community and on the Hill, is a focus on what's truly critical. There's recently a cyber incident notification legislation that didn't make it into the National Defense Authorization Act, but I think it's got some legs and opportunities ahead of it. And the policymakers were really honing in on, let's focus on the most important critical infrastructure, not everything. We'll get there eventually, but let's focus on what's important. And then that's where the partnerships are important to ensure that the government is providing the appropriate support and guidance to those critical infrastructures, at the same time evaluating where there may be some market failures and looking for opportunities for more regulatory steps. And we've seen that with pipelines and railways and some of the other modalities of transportation. And I think probably next is the water sector. So looking for those opportunities to work together, but where the market has perhaps failed, we can surge some additional resources.
On the side of businesses, we've seen ransomware attacks rising. You just mentioned a few that obviously also intersect with U.S. government interests. What should businesses do if they are faced with a ransomware attack? I mean, should they pay? I mean, should they, obviously, ideally they would alert the government, but when you're in that situation, what are your options, I suppose?
Unfortunately, that's a conversation. If you actually have to think about, if you have to pay, it's too late. I think what every organization needs to be doing right now, if they've had a prior ransomware event or not, is really think through what their strategy is and take a look at some of the guidance that's coming out from the government and from some of the data security companies, the information security companies, and look at what they can do right now. Multi-factor authentication, really hardcore identity management, segmentation across networks, backup recovery, make sure you have an incident response plan in place. The great thing that I've seen is since Colonial, since JBS, the meat processing company that was also hit over the course of the summer, is that a broader set of executives, a broader set of boards of directors, I think finally figured out that cyber's not just about intellectual property theft. It is, in fact, a business risk, not just a technical risk. And I've seen a significant amount of interest. So I feel as if we've had some changes out there in the business community. And I think it's really critically important that those executives, the boards, truly engage on the information security side, the cybersecurity side, and ask those teams, what do they need, and put them in a position to be successful to defend the organization.
Should they be thinking not just about trying to prevent those attacks, but since they're going to be a reality, how do we become more resilient? How do we reduce, I think you've used the term blast radius when it comes to those attacks. And I think that's, again, both for public assets and also for private ones.
Yeah, so you have to figure out or you have to realize that you are going to have a bad day. And so how do you minimize the impact of that bad day? I was talking to a CISO earlier in the summer where she mentioned that they'd had 40 some odd ransomware events in a month. And I kind of took my breath away for a moment. But the idea here was that it hit a single workstation and they contained it to that single workstation. That's the concept that I mentioned with blast radius. But what we're seeing is some recovery technologies start to emerge in the market that are not just the old school offline tape-based backup, but we're actually starting to see security-focused recovery capabilities, digital twins, things like that allow an organization to chop over to a clean environment and stand back up more rapidly. And I think that's one of those things that organizations need to be looking at. Look, you're going to have a bad day. Everybody has a bad day. It's okay. The key is how do you survive that incident and thrive, maintaining the trust of your employees, your stakeholders, as well as government partners.
On the government level, we saw President Biden communicating with President Putin from Russia just earlier this week. I'm sure cyber attacks were on the agenda there. How legitimate or how useful a tool can be international sanctions, for instance? I mean, how do you, as the U.S. again, kind of try to put out a sense of warning that don't try to do this because there will be consequences that really you will feel?
I'm a bit of a skeptic on the sanction side. I think we've sanctioned a significant amount of actors and oligarchs and friends and partners of Putin. I think there's more we could do. Secondary debt market of the things that Russia actually cares about, like some of their champions, Rosneft and Gazprom. We should look at some of those measures. But ultimately, diplomacy is just one tool in the toolkit that we have to deter adversaries. And I ultimately think that there are some things that are going to continue to happen that are effectively undeterrable, and we have to just defend against them. That's espionage. So we think about the SVR and that broader what's been called the Nobelium or SolarWinds campaign. That's just spies being spies and doing spy stuff. So that's the sort of thing we have to identify quickly and mitigate. It's these more destructive, undermining confidence attacks in government and industry that we need to focus on it and put a really hard line in the sand that says this is critical infrastructure. If you cross that line, there will be significant repercussions. And at the same time, using our own capabilities like cybercom and the intelligence community to go ahead and move forward into the adversary space and disable their ability to launch attacks and disrupt their abuse of the internet in third countries as well as here. And that's the trick, right? They're using our own internet infrastructure to launch and mask some of their attacks. We need to make it hostile territory for them.
And just very quickly, lastly, how concerned are you with the possibility of more directed attacks, including disinformation ones, specifically aimed at the 2022 or 2024 elections?
Disinformation, I think, is the great national security threat that we do not have a good answer for or our arms around. And that was one of the recommendations in the Aspen Commission on Information Disorder. We need a national security plan to counter disinformation.
Great. Christopher Krebs, thank you very much for joining us here.
Thanks so much, Brian.
Thank you all for joining this afternoon for another virtual conversation that has made everyone smarter, faster. For more info or to sign up for my Axios Future newsletter, visit axios.com/newsletters or on the Axios app. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you on axios.com.